If you're interested in swords, you'll probably know that this is a rapier, a Spanish cut-hilt rapier to be more precise. But did nowhere else in history come up with something like the rapier? Is it a purely European invention? Well, kind of, no. The Chinese also came up with a sword which could lay claim to the title of the Chinese rapier. Let's have a look at it. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now on this channel we have looked an awful lot at rapiers, and rightly so, because they're a very important and influential sword design, certainly in European history, and of course they were taken to the Americas and all over, thanks to colonialism, all over the world, and used against all sorts of opponents, including samurai and all sorts, Moors and everything. Right, so what have we got here? So fundamentally this is LK Chen's version rendition using, it must be said, modern materials. This isn't really a sword review, but I will mention some things about this model. This is the LK rendition of a shield guard Han Dynasty Jian. Now, for those of you who don't know about Chinese swords, let's unpack some of those terms. So it's summer, you're going to be spending more time outside, and what you want to do also is listen to your favourite music, podcasts. What you need is crystal clear sound, and you can do that with everyday earbuds from Raycon. Raycon's everyday earbuds are the perfect outdoors accessory, whether you're just going for a walk, cycling, on your way to the gym, or perhaps even HEMA training. But one of my absolute favourite things about these earbuds is the active noise cancellation, which to me is absolutely vital. Raycon's latest model is the best ever, with 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity, so you can connect two different devices at the same time. And something comparable, you're going to be looking at paying twice as much. These are about half the price of comparable earbuds. So apart from the price, which is great, my two favourite things about these earbuds are, number one, that noise cancellation, because it works really well, better than any other earbuds I've actually tried before. The second thing is the fact that they fit in my ears really well, and that's actually a feature of these earbuds, is that Raycon have actually designed these to fit the widest range of ears. So I've actually been using these on the treadmill as well, which we've got at home, and that's quite noisy, so I can hear absolutely great, so the noise cancellation works great. Now, something else you may have noticed is they come in a bunch of different funky colours, so you can choose a colour that suits your particular style. I chose some blue ones. I can't tell you why, I just fancied blue ones. And I had a matching blue case which wirelessly charges. You'll notice I have this cool cover on here, and you can choose loads of different patterns and styles they've got. I like this because it looked like stone. So if you want to get your own pair, you won't be disappointed, I promise you. You can go to buyraycon.com/scholar. We've got our own link, that's right, buyraycon.com/scholar, and you'll get 15% off Raycon's best-selling everyday earbuds. You're not going to be disappointed, and obviously thanks to Raycon for sponsoring this video. So first of all, Han Dynasty, what is that? Well, so China as we know it was not exactly the same area as it is now. The Han Dynasty controlled one particular part of what's now China, and there was an Eastern Han Dynasty and a Western Han Dynasty. But all you need to know, unless you want to go and Google it for yourself, but all you want to know as a headline is that the Han Dynasty was in China between about 200 BC and about 200 AD. So really we're talking here about like Roman era. Okay, now there's an interesting thing. If we just put this sword down for a second. During the Han Dynasty, there were a number of different swords and other weapons in use, and we've looked at one of these, the standard jian here. Jian really just means straight sword, a single-edged sword, or like a curved sword, a saber or a falchion would be called a dao, and dao really just means the same word as knife. It means a single-edged thing, but a jian is defined as having a straight double-edged blade. Okay, so there are single-edged swords in China at this time and double-edged swords. The jian is the double-edged straight sword. Now, jian actually come in a variety of different forms, different lengths, different widths rather, with different sort of tapers and shapes and everything else. Okay, in terms of the hilt, if you're not used to Chinese swords, one of the notable things about them is they have really quite minimalist hilts. In this period, quite characteristically small guards. Not to say that all of them do. You do get some with longer guards, and we've looked at those in previous videos. I'm sure we'll look at them again as well. And usually a form of disc pommel, but not always. And another characteristic thing about them, again, it's not always, but it's usually the case that the grip is quite a bit longer than the hand. Now, you might at first think that that is a two-handed grip, and in fact there are two-handed jian, but they tend to be a lot longer than this. Most jian like this are shown with a certain amount of hilt projecting beyond the hand, but still used one-handed. So you could make a comparison with the Burmese da, the krabi, for example, in Thailand, or indeed the langmesser in Europe. So in fact there are a whole bunch of swords in history which are used one-handed, but which still have quite a bit of hilt projecting beyond the hand, and usually that's mostly for balance reasons. Okay, it gives you a bit more balance rather than having a heavy pommel on the back. It actually gives you a bit more it brings your hand closer to the center of gravity, and therefore makes the sword a little bit more nimble and easy to use. But it does, by a byproduct and a kind of tangentially, give you some other techniques you can do with this extended bit here, where you can actually hook, for example, coming around behind someone's wrist in order to strip their weapon out of their hand, disarms, arm locks, this kind of thing. So you can use this extra bit of hilt in other interesting ways. But primarily, it seems, the main reason really is a question of balance. So this is, you could say, the kind of gentleman's or kind of aristocratic or noble sword of the Han Dynasty, is the long, tapering, quite narrow bladed jian. So how do we get from this standard jian, which was a pretty universal sword? Obviously there were big two-handed varieties as well, which we've looked at in previous videos. But this sort is the sort of sidearm sword, the equivalent of the arming sword or the side sword of medieval and Renaissance Europe. How do we get from that to the big shield-guarded version? Well, the story goes that during this period there was a rise in the prevalence of fencing schools. So here we've immediately got a comparison to late medieval and Renaissance Europe. Now these fencing schools, fundamentally, just like in Europe, taught gentlemen, people who had money, to fence, taught them how to fight, and indeed there were some forms of competitions and such like. So essentially fencing, we could call them martial arts schools, because obviously they probably encapsulated unarmed and spear and various other things as well, but basically fencing schools in the same sense as we had in Renaissance Europe. Now, within that context, certain specialised things seemed to develop. I'm going to put this sword down again and show you one other thing, which again we'll probably do a more dedicated video on at some point, which is the Go Rang. Now this was sent to me directly by LK Chen. He actually made this. This is one of the sort of prototypes that he was making at one point, I think. Now the Go Rang is a type of buckler, as you can see. It's got two important differences to it. One is these extending hooked bars at top and bottom, and the other one is this spike or point here. Now these have been found archaeologically, I believe, but they're also importantly shown in art being used by fencers in conjunction with the standard straight jian. So essentially sword and buckler. And again we have a parallel here to Renaissance Europe, because of course in the 16th century, for example, in Italy, or any other country really in the 16th century, sword and buckler was an incredibly popular fencing system. It's very versatile. It works against lots of other weapons, be they two-handed swords or spears or whatever else. You can use it on the battlefield, or you can use it in civilian self-defense. Obviously, this is somewhat different, and you could say more developed than a standard buckler. Okay, standard bucklers I've got on my walls over here. Just grab a typical round European buckler. So that is a pretty much typical medieval or early Renaissance round buckler. The main differences with this is this corrugated form here, which really is to give space for the hand to sit in behind, but additionally it can also assist in binding, particularly against thrusts, which we find with the European targa version of the buckler, which is a rectangular corrugated version of this instead of round and domed. These bars are absolutely fantastic at blocking above and below the buckler without having to move the hand to the height that the attack's coming in. But also importantly, these are very good for dealing with thrusts, and particularly against spears, but we'll look at that in a future video. And this also, this projecting lug or spike here, additionally assists with trapping, binding, possibly even disarms as well. So as far as we can tell, the standard armament at this time for fencers or people fighting in the street was the straight jian with quite a long, quite rapier-like blade. You can cut, you can thrust with it. We'll talk about that in a second. And the gorang. Okay, so these were at some point popular dueling weapons. Really, and we could say that there's a parallel there to European sword and buckler, as I've mentioned, but also rapier and dagger to some extent as well. And indeed, if we pop over to India for a second, the talwar used with the dal or buckler, or indeed versions of shield they have which are somewhat similar like this. But again, we'll do a deep dive on this in the future. So let's put the buckler away now and go back to talking about the sword. So the standard jian is a very versatile sword. Let's talk about that blade for a second. It is long. It's not quite as long as most European rapiers, or rather, it's as long as some European rapiers, but it's just that a lot of European rapiers even exceed that length. Now there are Chinese blades which exceed this length, but they tend to be on the two-handed swords. But nevertheless, there's an enormous amount of parallel between the rapier and the jian here. And in fact, if I just put that jian and that rapier down for a second, I'm going to go to a slightly different form of rapier here, as it so happens, from LK Chen again. So this is what we sometimes term a military rapier, and you'll see that with this, you might be thinking with the rapier was narrower than the jian. In this case, this rapier is actually slightly wider than the jian. So rapiers can come in many different forms, as we've looked at in previous videos, and some of them have more capacity to cut impressively than others. Most rapiers can cut to some extent, but some can just cut better than others. And obviously when you have a slightly wider blade, you sacrifice some of the nimbleness of the point, should we say. Right, so back to the jian. So this blade is very comparable to 16th and 17th century European rapier blades, but obviously the hilt is completely unlike it. Now, this is important, very important, because if you're using a blade like this primarily or almost entirely for point and thrusting, it's very, very easy for two blades to come in and for a person to be thrust in the hand, wrist or forearm. Okay, which means that you really having this type of sword, yes, you can use it, avoiding the hand from incoming blades and just moving it out of the way the whole time, but it means that your style of swordsmanship becomes very, very focused on not getting hit in the hand, which takes away attention that you would normally put into defeating the opponent. So it means that you have to put an awful lot more brain power and attention into not being disabled in the hand. So it seems quite obvious, therefore, that they moved towards handguards in dueling situations. We'll talk about why maybe not war situations in a second. This is therefore sort of a similar evolution to the rapier, or rather the cup hilt rapier specifically. You could say saber guards as well. We'll talk about saber guards in a second, in Europe. Now, we're fairly sure that developed handguards that protect the hand are associated with people who aren't wearing hand protection, civilians, also where the objective might be to disable or incapacitate an opponent, but not necessarily to kill them. So dueling. On the battlefield, when hand protection starts to come in, we often see that battlefield swords still have minimal hand protection. And one reason for that is people wearing armour, potentially, you know, even if it's just gloves or definitely gauntlets, this kind of stuff on the hands. So one possible explanation is normally soldiers have hand protection on, so they don't need the hand protection that a civilian would do. But there is another element to it. If you just look at these hilts for a second, they are not particularly easy to wear. They're more cumbersome, they're more likely to get in the way. And remember, on a battlefield, the sword is not usually your primary weapon. I know I bang on about this point a lot, but usually on the battlefield, your primary weapon is a bow, a crossbow, a gun, a pike, a halberd, a poleaxe, you know, these sorts of weapons. So usually either polearms or missile weapons. The sword is usually a sidearm, in other words, an arm, a weapon that you wear at your side. okay, like a pistol today. So, if you want quick and easy access and fairly easy wearing to a sword, often it's more attractive to have less on the hilt, and therefore make it a hell of a lot easier to wear, and in some cases quicker to deploy and pull out when you need to. And this is I'm not sure I buy into it, but this is some people's explanation for why Japanese swords like the tachi and the katana, or uchi katana, and the wakizashi have pretty minimalist guards on them. Anyway, in a dueling situation it's different because you've both got your weapons out, you might be using a buckler of some sort, so having hand protection is really a big advantage. Right, so it should be fairly self-evident what this handguard does and what it protects. It's a shield to the front of your hand, and you've still got the Jien crossguard across the top of there, and in fact it's quite extended, so it's quite a long crossguard by the standards of the Jien of the day. So that's not the full story. So one of the things you may have noticed when I was holding these two weapons up is that the thrusting weapon that is the rapier, that basically is about 90% thrust and 10% cut, has the guard pointed towards the point, because you're usually holding the weapon like this. An interesting thing to me, and obviously we don't have any manuals from 2,000 years ago for the Han Dynasty Jien, an interesting thing to me is that this guard doesn't protect the top, which would strongly suggest to me that while I can hold this in exactly the same way as a rapier, and I could use it, or at least move it like a rapier, holding the sword like that means that the shield guard becomes completely and utterly pointless and meaningless, okay? It doesn't protect the hand at all. In order for that shield guard to work, I have to be holding it like that. Now, what's the interesting thing is that if I move from a primarily point forward guard to a guard which actually points the shield towards the opponent's weapon or towards the opponent, we're not actually using this like a rapier, really. Now, not to say that all rapier systems stand, you know, like Spanish rapier in a straight line here. Many are more like this, okay, at this angle. But even here, the hand's not really protected very well. I've got an immense amount of protection, practically bulletproof protection to the front and none to the top. So, using my enormous powers of deduction, and it should be clear to anybody watching this video, it's fairly obvious to me that the people that use these specific guards probably held the sword like this, which makes it more like a backsword or broadsword or sabre. Now, if we just corroborate that line of thinking with another piece of data, we don't have a lot of these shield guards surviving. They have been found archaeologically, okay? However, they're definitely not common. There definitely weren't a lot of them. Most people were using the standard Jien with no real handguard to speak of. However, the ones that we have found with handguards, we've actually found ones, many of these don't have the shield guard, they actually have a knucklebow guard, which makes them somewhat similar to knucklebow guards on sabres like this. Now, we know from looking at European sources, I've got too many swords here, let's put that one down there. We know from looking at European sources that when you've only got a knucklebow, yes, you do sometimes fence with it out here. The hand's very vulnerable there. So very often if we look at later sabre systems which use what we would call a half basket guard, okay, so there's a half basket guard, that protects well to the top and well to the front. So in that case I could stand with the guard like that, or I could stand with the guard like that, or like that, or like that, and it protects fairly well the hand. If the opponent has got their sword extended as well, and I've got this sort of sword here, yes, I can sort of get away with doing this so long as I'm mindful of the fact that my hand is very vulnerable. Generally speaking, we see guards more like this, prime and second. Terce, instead of being very extended like that, is often held more retracted like that. And you have to rely on just that bar at the front. So your hand is a lot more vulnerable. So you can see why some people moved to these shield guards. But fundamentally, the knucklebow provides less protection, but it's still a lot more than a standard Jien. So it's definitely more protection. But here's the headline. Both of these guards, whether it's a knucklebow or a shield guard, protect the front, they don't protect the top. So let's bring this back. Is the Jien Is this a Chinese Han Dynasty rapier? Not exactly. The blade kind of yes, the hilt kind of no. Obviously, not all rapiers have cup hilts. As we've seen here, some rapiers have swept hilts of various sorts, and some rapiers' swept hilts leave quite a fair amount of opening to the front, but they are still protected to the front, more so than to the sides. Whereas the shield guard here, I mean, this is so comparing a swept hilt there, you can see that the bars are mostly arranged forwards, not to the sides of the hilt. This is the complete opposite, okay? So that strongly suggests to me that in Han Dynasty dueling, rather than always having the weapon forwards like this, they probably usually had the sword more forwards like that, okay, more with the point upwards, and probably were relying on quick, lightning quick slashes, and yes, thrusts as well, but I don't think that their guard position would have been particularly extended. I think it would have been more forward like this. So, to conclude, the LK Chen shield guard Jian, is it a Chinese version of a European rapier? Not really, but there's some similarities there. Definitely the blade's similar. I would say the guard is actually far more similar to European sabre and basket hilts instead. Finally, what do I think of the LK Chen version? It's very good. Bear in mind it is made of modern materials, so the guard components are stainless steel. The blade is beautifully made. It's super sharp. You can find other people cutting with it online. It's got great temper, flex and heat treatment. It's got good hardness versus flex. I have cut bottles with it, but nothing more tough so far. In terms of the handling, it is a little bit odd, and LK Chen has made a video about this himself. It is based on the statistics of the archaeological surviving one, but it's quite back weighted. That does mean it's very nimble with the tip, but quite heavy in the hand. But it's a really interesting sword, and a much overlooked form of Chinese sword, or just any form of sword. I don't think many people. Were you familiar with this? Did you know about these? Post down below, because I'd be really interested to know how many of you actually knew about this. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. So anyway, check them out. If you fancy one, you can buy one quite affordably. And thanks a lot for watching the channel. I will see you back really soon. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.